The sun was high in the sky, and the city streets buzzed with the sound of traffic. Expensive cars glided past, rushing to their destinations, while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks. In the middle of all this movement, a sleek luxury car stood still on the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked, a signal of helplessness in the fast-paced world around it. Inside the car sat a woman who seemed out of place in her current situation. She was a well-known CEO, the kind of person whose name appeared in business magazines and whose face often lit up on TV screens during interviews about success. She was wealthy, powerful, and respected in boardrooms. Yet here she was, tapping her manicured nails against the steering wheel. Furious that her expensive car had failed her. Her irritation wasn't just about the breakdown. To her, the car stopping in the middle of her busy schedule felt like an insult. She wasn't used to being delayed. Everything in her life ran according to her plans: meetings, flights, deals, even dinners. But today, fate had chosen to test her patience. She got out of the car and waved at a few drivers passing by, but none stopped. Some looked, recognized her face, and hurried away, not wanting to get involved. She sighed in frustration. Just when she was about to call for roadside service, a man in work clothes approached. His shirt was stained with grease, his hands rough from years of labor. He was a mechanic from a nearby workshop, walking back after completing another job. "Need some help, ma'am?" he asked calmly, noticing the hood of her car still closed. She turned to look at him, her eyes scanning his clothes, his face, and his confident but humble posture. Instead of seeing help, she saw someone beneath her status. Her pride got in the way, and instead of answering politely, she smirked. "You?" she said, raising her eyebrows. "This is not some old bike. It's a luxury car worth more than you'll ever earn. What could you possibly do?" Her tone carried arrogance, but the man didn't flinch. He had heard worse in life. Years of working with people from all walks of life had made him immune to such remarks. Still, he stayed quiet, waiting for her to decide if she wanted his help. She crossed her arms and laughed sarcastically. "All right then, let's make this fun. If you can fix my car, I'll make you my husband. But if you can't, don't waste my time." Her words were meant to humiliate, a careless challenge thrown out of frustration. People on the sidewalk who overheard chuckled. Some even stopped, sensing drama about to unfold. The mechanic looked at her, his eyes steady. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see what's wrong with it." Without another word, he walked over to the car and popped open the hood. The CEO leaned against the side, folding her arms tighter, waiting to see him fail. The engine looked complicated, far beyond the simple fixes most mechanics handled on the roadside. It wasn't a regular problem either. Several experts had already tried repairing this car in the past, but the issue kept coming back. She knew this, which was why she had mocked him in the first place. She was certain he would give up within minutes, but he didn't. With practiced eyes, the mechanic studied the engine. His hands moved with confidence, touching wires, checking connections, listening to the faint sounds when he turned the ignition. He worked silently, without showing any signs of doubt. The small crowd that had gathered began whispering among themselves, curious to see what would happen. The CEO, meanwhile, scrolled through her phone, pretending she wasn't paying attention. Yet every time she heard a tool clink or the sound of him working, she glanced at him, wondering if he would actually discover something. Minutes turned into nearly half an hour. Sweat formed on the mechanic's forehead, but he stayed focused. He wasn't doing this to impress her. He wasn't doing it because of her careless promise. He was doing it because he loved his craft, because every broken machine was like a puzzle waiting to be solved. When he finally stepped back, the CEO looked up, almost surprised he was still there. He wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Try it now." She raised an eyebrow but slid into the driver's seat. With a sigh, she turned the key. To her shock, the car that had been lifeless for so long suddenly roared back to life, the engine humming as smoothly as if it were brand new. The crowd gasped, some clapped, others whistled. The CEO's face froze. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her arrogant words now echoed in her own mind, "Fix my car, and you'll be my husband." For the first time that day, silence fell around her, The engine's smooth hum filled the air, silencing every doubt that had been floating around only moments earlier. People who had gathered stood in awe, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. The man had done what many believed was impossible. The CEO, still sitting in the driver's seat, kept her hands on the steering wheel. Her face was frozen between disbelief and embarrassment. She had been so sure this mechanic would fail, so certain that his rough hands and modest clothes meant he couldn't possibly understand the complexity of her expensive car. And yet, here she was, sitting in a car that finally came back to life all because of him. Or slowly, she stepped out of the vehicle. Her eyes avoided the stares of the crowd. For a woman who always carried herself with authority, this was the first time in years she felt small. The words she had spoken earlier, careless, sharp, arrogant, now rang in her ears louder than the sound of the engine. "Fix my car and you'll be my husband." The mechanic stood calmly, wiping his hands with his rag, not saying a word. He had no interest in embarrassing her further, nor did he look like a man waiting for some reward. He simply seemed satisfied with the fact that he had solved the problem. The silence became unbearable. Finally, one of the onlookers chuckled, breaking the tension. Others began murmuring, "Didn't she say? Isn't he supposed to be her husband now?" Laughter rippled through the small crowd. The CEO's cheeks burned. She had spent her life commanding respect in conference rooms and business meetings, and now strangers were laughing at her on the street. It wasn't just the laughter, it was the realization that she had brought this on herself. She cleared her throat and forced a smile, trying to mask her discomfort. "Well," she said, her voice slightly trembling, "you got lucky. Maybe the car just needed a little push." The mechanic looked at her, not with anger or pride, but with a calm expression that made her uneasy. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he replied gently. "Sometimes it just takes patience and the right touch. Every problem has a solution if you're willing to look deep enough." His words, though simple, cut deeper than any insult could have. She stood there quietly, unable to come up with a quick remark. For the first time, she felt as though she wasn't the smartest person in the room, or rather, on the street. The people who had been watching slowly dispersed, but the moment remained heavy between them. The mechanic started packing his tools back into his small bag, preparing to leave. To him, it was just another job. He didn't crave applause or attention. Fixing things was his life's work, and once the job was done, he moved on. But for the CEO, it wasn't that simple. She couldn't just move on. Something about the way he carried himself, calm, steady, and unshaken even after her harsh words, stirred something inside her. She had met countless men in boardrooms, men who bowed to her power, men who wanted something from her. Yet this mechanic, with no wealth or status to his name, stood taller in that moment than any of them ever had. She found herself calling out to him before he could walk away. "Wait." He stopped and turned, his eyes still calm. She hesitated, then finally said, I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." The words felt heavy on her tongue. Apologies were rare for her. She was more used to receiving them than giving them. But this time, she had no choice. "You didn't deserve that." The mechanic nodded slightly, acknowledging her words. "It's all right," he said. "People say a lot of things when they're upset. What matters is what they do afterward." That response stunned her. No bitterness, no sarcasm, just a quiet wisdom she didn't expect. She realized in that instant that he wasn't the one who had been humiliated. She was. He had walked through her arrogance without stumbling. While she had exposed her own pride for the world to see, she tried to regain her composure. "You must have fixed a lot of cars in your life," she said, attempting to sound casual. He shrugged. "Enough to know every machine has its weakness. But I also know the hardest thing to fix is the way people see each other." That line hit her harder than the roar of her car's engine. For years, she had measured people by their status, their money, their usefulness to her world. She had looked at this man and seen nothing more than dirty clothes and rough hands. But now, standing there with her car running perfectly, she saw him differently. "Do you always talk like that?" she asked softly, half curious, half defensive. "Only when someone needs to hear it," he said, giving a faint smile before turning away again. She stood there, watching him leave. A strange mix of emotions filled her chest: relief that her car was fixed, shame for how she had treated him, and curiosity about the kind of person he really was. She wanted to call him back, to say more, but her pride held her tongue. Instead, she sat back in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel powerful. She felt human, vulnerable, and strangely enough, she couldn't stop thinking about the mechanic, the man she had tried to insult, but who had walked away with all the dignity in the world. That night, long after she had returned to her luxurious apartment, the memory of his calm face and steady words haunted her. She replayed the scene again and again, her laughter, the crowd's whispers, his quiet determination, and the way the engine had roared back to life. She had built her empire on confidence and control. But this man had dismantled both without raising his voice. He had taught her a lesson she had never expected to learn, not in boardrooms, not from business rivals, but on the side of a busy street with grease-stained hands. And for the first time, she found herself wondering, who was he really? The next morning, the city woke up to another busy day. Office buildings lit up with fluorescent lights, taxis honked, and coffee shops buzzed with chatter. The world seemed unchanged. But for the CEO, something was different. She sat in her corner office, surrounded by glass walls and a skyline view most people only dreamed of. Yet the view that once made her feel powerful now left her unsettled. Papers were stacked neatly on her desk. Her schedule was filled with meetings, and assistants rushed in and out. Still, her mind was far from the spreadsheets and deals in front of her. Her thoughts kept returning to the man she had met on the street, the mechanic. The way he had worked silently, without needing validation. The way he had spoken with calmness that cut through her arrogance. And most of all, the way he had left without demanding anything, not money, not attention, not even recognition. For someone like her, this was unusual. In her world, people always wanted something. Every handshake, every smile, every kind word usually came with hidden expectations. Yet this man had fixed her problem and walked away as though it meant nothing. She leaned back in her leather chair, sighing. Her assistant noticed the unusual silence, but didn't dare ask questions. Everyone in the office knew she was a woman who did not like being interrupted. When she was deep in thought. Meanwhile, across the city, the mechanic had returned to his modest workshop. The place wasn't fancy, just a small garage tucked between two old brick buildings. The roof leaked when it rained, and the walls were covered in posters of cars that had long gone out of fashion. But inside, it was his world. Tools hung in perfect order, and every bolt and screw had its place. He worked quietly on another vehicle, humming to himself as he tightened a loose chain. Unlike the CEO, he wasn't thinking about yesterday. For him, fixing cars was routine, and the encounter on the street was just another job. He had no idea that the woman he had helped was still carrying the weight of that moment. But as the day went on, her thoughts grew heavier. By the evening, she found herself sitting alone in her luxury apartment, sipping coffee she barely tasted. Her phone buzzed with calls from investors and directors, but she ignored them. Instead, she replayed her own words from yesterday. "Fix my car, and you'll be my husband." She shook her head in frustration. "What was I thinking?" she muttered to herself. It wasn't just the embarrassment, it was the fact that she had reduced another human being to a joke. And he had proven her wrong with dignity for the first time. She felt a strange pull and need to know who he really was. Not as the man who fixed her car, but as a person. What was his story? What gave him that quiet strength? Why did he feel so different from the people she knew? The next day, unable to resist her curiosity, she had her driver take her to the part of town where her car had broken down. She retraced her steps, asking a few shopkeepers if they knew the mechanic she had met. Most of them nodded and pointed toward a small garage at the end of the street. When she arrived, she hesitated outside. The place was nothing like the polished offices she was used to. The smell of oil and rubber hung in the air, and the sound of tools echoed inside. For a moment, her pride almost stopped her from entering, but something stronger pushed her forward. She stepped inside, and there he was, bent over an old van, wiping sweat from his forehead, lost in his work. He didn't notice her at first, and she stood quietly, watching him. The way he moved, the way he handled the machine, it wasn't just work. It was passion, almost like an artist painting on a canvas, Finally, he looked up and noticed her. His expression didn't change much, just a small nod of acknowledgement. "You again," he said simply, his voice calm as ever. She cleared her throat, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, words didn't come easily to her. I just wanted to thank you properly," she managed. He wiped his hands on a rag, shrugged, and said, "No need. The car needed fixing. That's all." His simplicity unsettled her even more. In her world, nothing was ever just something. Every act was tied to favors, deals, or expectations. Yet here he was, dismissing her gratitude as though it were unnecessary. She glanced around the workshop, noticing how worn out everything looked. "Do you run this place alone?" she asked, trying to start a conversation. "Yes," he replied. "Been doing it for years, and you enjoy it?" She pressed further. He looked at her, his eyes steady. "Enjoying it doesn't matter. It's honest work. Keeps me grounded." His answer struck her. She was a woman who had built her empire on ambition, constantly chasing the next big thing. Yet here was a man who found peace in the simple rhythm of honest labor. She envied him in a way she couldn't explain. She walked closer, lowering her voice. "You know, I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did. I don't usually." She paused, realizing how weak her excuses sounded. "I guess I thought money and status meant more than they should. Yesterday showed me I was wrong." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he replied, "People forget that respect doesn't cost anything. It's free to give, but it means the world when received." The words lingered in the air, heavier than any lecture she had ever heard. She stood there, feeling like a student in front of a teacher. She found herself returning to his workshop again the next day, and then again the day after. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes she just stood and watched him work, listening to the way he explained things to customers or laughed with children who wandered in to watch. Slowly, she began to see a side of life she had long forgotten, a world where people valued kindness more than profit, where conversations weren't about power but about real human connection. And each time she left, she couldn't help but think, maybe the impossible thing he fixed wasn't just her car. Maybe, without even trying, he had started fixing her. The days began to form a rhythm she never expected. For years, her life had been measured in conference calls, flight schedules, and endless meetings. Now, without even realizing how it happened, her afternoons often ended at that small garage on the corner of the street. At first, she told herself it was curiosity, that she just wanted to learn more about the man who had embarrassed her with his calm wisdom. But over time, she knew it was more than that. Something about the mechanic's quiet strength, his unshakable dignity, pulled her back again and again. One afternoon, she arrived at the workshop with 2 cups of tea. The smell of oil and rubber filled the air as always, and the sound of a wrench echoed against metal. He looked up when she walked in, his expression steady, not surprised anymore by her visits. "You're here again," he said, almost like a statement rather than a question. She smiled faintly, holding out a cup. "Thought you might need this." He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." There was no over-the-top gratitude, no attempt to flatter her, just a simple acknowledgement. And strangely, she liked it that way. For once, she wasn't being treated like a CEO or a wealthy woman, just like another person. They sat onto old chairs near the entrance, sipping their tea in silence at first. The city moved outside, cars honking, people rushing, but inside the garage, time seemed slower. She finally broke the silence. "Don't you ever get tired of this?" she asked, gesturing toward the grease-stained floors and half-repaired vehicles. He glanced around, then shook his head. "Tired, yes, but never unhappy. Work like this keeps me honest. Every day is a challenge, every car a new story. It's not glamorous, but it's real." His words lingered in her mind. Real. She thought about her own world: polished offices, glossy magazines, fake smiles at dinner parties. How much of it was real? How much of it was just a mask she wore to keep control? Sometimes, she admitted quietly, "I wonder if everything I've built actually means anything. Success, wealth, power, it all looks great from the outside. But," she trailed off, realizing how strange it felt to open up like this to someone she barely knew. But he didn't laugh at her vulnerability, nor did he rush to give advice. He simply said, If it doesn't feel meaningful, then maybe it's not. Maybe you're chasing the wrong things. That simple truth hit her harder than any speech she had heard in her entire career. For a moment, she sat silently, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup, staring at the floor. Later that evening, when she returned to her apartment, she couldn't shake the thought. She looked around at the expensive furniture, the endless rooms filled with things she rarely used. It all looked beautiful, but somehow it felt empty. The next day, she returned to the garage again. This time, she found him working on an old truck. His hands were blackened with grease, his shirt damp with sweat, but his focus never wavered. "You work too hard," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He glanced at her with a small smile. "Work is what keeps me going. Besides, this is nothing compared to what life throws at you." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment, then went back to tightening a bolt. "Let's just say I've had harder things to fix than cars. Machines are simple. People are complicated." There was something in his tone, a heaviness that made her curious. She wanted to ask more, but she respected his silence. Instead, she sat quietly, watching him work. As days turned into weeks, she learned little pieces about him. He lived in a small house nearby, modest but neat. He had no family in the city, no one waiting for him at home. He had grown up with hardship, working from a young age to survive. Every wrinkle on his hands, every scar on his arms carried a story of struggle. And yet, he carried himself with a peace she couldn't understand. One afternoon, as they shared another cup of tea, she asked, "Why didn't you say anything that day? When I insulted you? You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone. You could have demanded something, but you didn't." He looked at her, his eyes calm. "Because dignity isn't about how others treat you. It's about how you treat yourself. If I had answered your insult with anger, I'd have lost mine. Why let someone else decide who I am?" The simplicity of his answer left her speechless. In her world, people fought for respect, demanded recognition, argued over the smallest slights. Yet here was a man who had found a way to rise above all of that, not by fighting, but by holding onto his own dignity. That night, she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, she felt restless, not because of business deals or corporate stress, but because of her own reflection. The mechanic had become a mirror she couldn't avoid. Every word he spoke, every calm gesture, forced her to confront who she really was. She thought about how she had mocked him, reduced him to a joke, and how he had responded with patience and quiet strength. The more she replayed it in her mind, the more she realized that the real humiliation hadn't been his, it had been hers. And yet, instead of resenting him for it, she found herself admiring him. The next day, she arrived at the garage earlier than usual. He was already at work, as always. She stood there for a moment before saying, "Can I help?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Help? Yes," she said firmly. "I don't know anything about cars, but maybe I can hand you tools or something." For a moment, he studied her, as if deciding whether she was serious. Then, to her surprise, he handed her a wrench. "All right then, let's see what you've got." And so, for the first time in her life, the woman who had been known as a powerful CEO found herself kneeling beside a mechanic, holding tools, learning about engines, listening to the sound of clinking metal instead of boardroom debates. Her expensive clothes got stained, her nails chipped, and grease smudged her hands. But strangely, she didn't mind. For once, she felt grounded. For once, she felt human. And as she looked up at the mechanic, who worked beside her with the same calm focus as always, she realized something that scared her more than any business risk ever had. She wasn't just learning about cars. She was learning about life. The polished conference room glowed under the bright lights, its long glass table reflecting the faces of suited executives. Laptops clicked, charts appeared on screens, and voices overlapped in heated discussions about profits, targets, and deadlines. At the head of the table sat the CEO. Her posture was straight, her voice steady, and her words sharp as always. To the people in the room, she looked the same, confident, in control, unshakable. But inside, her mind was far away. Every time someone presented a slide or spoke about millions in revenue, her thoughts wandered back to the mechanic's workshop, The smell of oil, the sound of tools, the way he spoke so calmly about dignity and real value, it all clashed with the artificial world around her. And if we close this deal, our quarterly profit margin increases by 9%. One executive announced proudly. Applause followed, but the CEO barely reacted. She stared at the numbers, her expression unreadable. But her thoughts were elsewhere. 9% more profit. But what does it mean? Does it change anyone's life? Or is it just another empty victory? For the first time, she felt the boardroom, her kingdom, suffocating. After the meeting, she excused herself quickly. She told her assistant she had urgent personal business and left in her car. The driver asked where to, and she surprised herself with the answer, the garage. When she arrived, the mechanic was crouched under a small car, fixing a stubborn pipe. He rolled out on his back when he heard her heels clicking on the pavement. His expression was calm as always, though his eyebrows raised slightly. Busy day, he asked. She sighed, loosening her blazer and setting it on a chair. The usual. Meetings, numbers, people pretending they care about things that don't really matter. He smiled faintly. That's the world you live in. She sat down on an old stool, resting her chin on her hand. I used to think it was everything. Now I'm not so sure. He went back to work, his voice echoing from under the car. Doubt can be a good thing. It means you're starting to see. She frowned. See what? That not all success is success. He replied simply. His words sat in her mind like a heavy stone. For years, she had chased achievements, built her empire, demanded respect. But now she wondered, was it really respect, or just fear? Was her life filled with meaning, or just filled with things? Over the next few days, her visits to the garage became more frequent. Sometimes she brought food, other times just conversation. She found herself laughing at his dry humor, listening to his simple philosophies, and even daring to get her hands dirty when he let her hand him tools. But outside that small garage, her old world still called to her. Invitations to glamorous events, demands from investors, the endless hunger for more. She couldn't escape it completely, and soon, both worlds began to clash. One evening, she attended a high-profile charity gala. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, music floated in the air, and guests clinked glasses filled with expensive champagne. She wore a gown that sparkled under the lights, her presence commanding attention as always. But as she moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging rehearsed smiles, she felt strangely hollow. The compliments about her dress, the polite laughter at her jokes, all of it felt shallow compared to the laughter she shared. In the dusty garage, sitting on a wooden stool, sipping tea from paper cups. Then, one of the guests, a wealthy businessman, leaned close with a smug smile. I heard your car broke down a while back. Must have been a nightmare. I hope you had a proper service take care of it. She froze for a moment, her mind flashing back to the mechanic's calm face. The businessman chuckled. I can't imagine you stuck with some street worker. That would have been quite the sight. The CEO forced a smile, but inside anger stirred. For the first time, she felt protective, not of herself, but of the man who had fixed her car, who had taught her more in silence than most people taught with speeches. She excused herself from the ballroom and stepped outside onto the balcony. The cold air brushing her face, she realized she was standing between two worlds, one filled with money, prestige, and shallow admiration, and the other filled with humility, honesty, and quiet strength. Which one mattered more? Later that night, when her driver asked where to go, she didn't hesitate. Take me to the garage. The mechanic was still working late, his hands blackened with grease. She stood quietly, watching him until he noticed. You're here again, he said, with that familiar calm tone. She nodded, her voice softer than usual. I just came from a gala. Everyone looked perfect. The room was filled with wealth. And yet, I felt more alive here, in this dusty place, than I did in that ballroom. He didn't reply at first, just handed her a rag. Then maybe you already know which place is real. She took the rag, her eyes lowering. For the first time, she admitted aloud, you make me question everything I've built. And that scares me. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe fear is the first step toward change. His words sank deep into her chest. She realized then that she wasn't just curious about him anymore. She admired him. She respected him. And though she hardly dared admit it, she felt something more, a connection she had never expected with someone so far from her world. But she also knew the world she came from wouldn't understand. Her investors, her friends, even the media, they would mock her. Just like the people on the street had that day. The thought of it made her chest tighten still. As she stood there in the dimly lit garage, hearing the steady rhythm of tools and the mechanic's calm presence beside her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. And for the first time in her life, she realized that peace was worth more than power. The news didn't take long to spread. In her world, whispers traveled faster than the speed of light. At first, it was just casual chatter in business circles. Have you noticed how she disappears in the afternoons? She doesn't attend the same parties anymore. Then came the sharper whispers. She's been seen in the lower part of town, near a garage. For a woman of her stature, such talk was poison. Appearances mattered more than truth. Every move was observed, every rumor magnified. Yet she found herself caring less about the whispers and more about the quiet man, who continued to work on broken machines without complaint. One morning, her closest advisor came into her office, holding a newspaper. He placed it on her desk carefully, as if delivering bad news. On the second page, tucked between business columns, was a photograph of her. She was standing outside the mechanic's garage, her blazer folded over one arm, sipping tea from a paper cup. The headline beneath read, "CEO of Fortune Company spotted at local garage. What's the story?" She stared at the image, her stomach tightening. The picture captured something raw, not her polished, commanding self, but her relaxed posture and faint smile, the kind of smile she hadn't worn in years. Her advisor cleared his throat. "People are asking questions. Investors, the board. They're wondering what exactly you're doing there. It doesn't look good." She looked up at him, her voice calm. "Doesn't look good to whom?" "To everyone," he replied firmly. "Your reputation is built on control, on class. You can't be seen spending time with a street mechanic. It will ruin your image." For a moment, anger flickered in her chest. The words stung not because of what they meant to her, but because of what they implied about him. As if his worth as a human being was measured by his clothes, his job, his neighborhood. She folded the newspaper, her voice sharp. "My image is mine to decide, not theirs." Her advisor hesitated, then left the room, but the unease lingered. She knew the world she lived in wouldn't let this go easily. That evening, she drove herself to the garage, her car pulling up quietly under the fading light. He was there, as always, bent over an engine. When he saw her, he gave the same nod he always did, calm, steady, unaffected by the world outside. "You're late today," he said, wiping his hands. She managed to smile. "Got caught up dealing with gossip." He looked at her curiously. "About me. About us," she admitted. "Someone took a picture. Now they're talking, saying I shouldn't be here, that it looks bad." He leaned back against the car, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think?" She paused, searching for her own truth. "I think they don't understand. They don't know what I've learned here." He nodded slowly. "People will always talk. That's their job. Yours is to decide whose voice matters." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not that simple. My company depends on me. Investors trust me to maintain a certain image. If I break that image, I risk losing everything I built." His gaze was steady, cutting through her excuses. "And if keeping that image means losing yourself, is it worth it?" Her chest tightened. It was a question she didn't want to answer, yet it echoed in her mind long after she left the garage that night. The following week, the tension grew. At a board meeting, one of the older members leaned forward with a sly smile. "We admire your adventurous spirit," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But surely you understand the importance of staying within your circle. People of your position don't belong in certain places." She clenched her jaw but said nothing. For the first time, she realized how deeply the chains of expectation had been wrapped around her life. Later, in the quiet of her office, she stared out at the skyline. The buildings stretched tall and proud, monuments of success. Yet none of them gave her peace. Peace only existed in that small garage, where the hum of tools and the mechanic's calm voice drowned out the noise of the world. Her phone buzzed. It was an invitation to a grand award ceremony where she was to be honored. As Businesswoman of the Year, it should have been a moment of triumph, yet she felt strangely numb. What good was an award if she felt empty inside? That evening, she returned to the garage once again. He was closing up, stacking tools and wiping down surfaces. She stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "Why is it," she asked softly, "that in your world, people have so little, yet they seem happier than anyone I know in mine?" He looked at her, then gestured to the cars lined up. "Because happiness isn't built on things. It's built on peace, on dignity, on knowing who you are without needing others to tell you." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I don't even know who I am anymore." He walked closer, his voice steady. "Then maybe it's time to find out. But that's something only you can do." Her eyes stung, though she blinked back the tears. In her world, showing weakness was forbidden. Yet here, in this dusty little garage, she felt safe enough to be human. As she drove home that night, her mind raced. The world outside was ready to judge her, to pull her back into its polished trap. But inside, she felt a growing strength, a quiet voice telling her that perhaps she didn't need the world's approval. Perhaps what she needed was to finally choose herself. And maybe, just maybe, the mechanic had already begun teaching her how. The award ceremony was the kind of event she had once lived for. The ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, cameras flashed, and a red carpet stretched across the entrance like a ribbon of pride. Guests in expensive suits and gowns mingled, their laughter echoing across the hall. She arrived in her usual style, elegant, poised, every eye turning toward her. Applause greeted her as she took her seat at the front. On stage, speeches praised her achievements, her leadership, her empire. The kind of praise that used to make her heart swell now felt strangely hollow. When her name was called, she rose gracefully and walked to the stage. The host handed her the golden trophy, and the audience erupted in claps. She smiled for the cameras, but her eyes drifted across the crowd. In that sea of faces, she saw admiration, envy, and expectation, but not a single trace of sincerity. She gripped the trophy tightly, the lights blinding her. A thought echoed in her mind. "This is what I built. But is this who I am?" Her voice into the microphone began as usual, calm, polished, professional. "Thank you for this honor. It represents years of dedication, sacrifice, and relentless pursuit of excellence." The crowd nodded, ready for her usual speech about success and ambition. But then she paused. Her gaze dropped to the shining surface of the award in her hands, and for the first time, she didn't see her reflection. She saw the mechanic, his grease-stained hands, his calm eyes, his words about dignity and truth. Her heart raced. She took a deep breath. "But I need to be honest with you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Lately, I've started to ask myself if success is only about numbers and trophies. If all of this," she gestured around the glittering room, "is really enough." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some looked shocked, others confused. She continued, her tone stronger now. "I met someone recently, someone who reminded me that respect, peace, and honesty matter more than any title or award. And that maybe we've forgotten what it means to be real." The murmurs grew louder. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every word. "I won't stand here and pretend that this trophy makes me complete," she said firmly. "Because it doesn't. What makes us complete is how we treat people, not their status, not their wealth, but their humanity." With that, she placed the trophy on the podium and stepped away. The hall erupted not with applause, but with whispers, gasps, and disbelief. She walked out of the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step echoing like a drumbeat of freedom. For the first time in her career, she hadn't spoken to impress. She had spoken her truth. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin. She removed her heels, carrying them in her hand, and felt the ground beneath her feet. She called her driver but then stopped herself. Instead, she hailed a simple cab. The driver looked surprised, but said nothing as she gave him the address of the small garage. When she arrived, the lights inside were still on. The mechanic was working late again, his hands deep in another repair. She stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment. "You're here," he said, glancing up. His tone was calm, as always, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. She stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "I walked out of the ceremony tonight." He wiped his hands, raising an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because for the first time, I realized that none of it matters if I can't respect myself." She replied, "And being around you, it reminded me of what really matters." He leaned against the workbench, listening quietly. She continued, "You once told me that dignity isn't about how others treat you, but how you treat yourself. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I've spent years building an image, but I never built peace inside myself. And I think that's what I've been searching for." For a moment, the silence between them felt heavy. She half expected him to dismiss her words, to remind her that she belonged to a different world. But instead, he simply said, "Then maybe you're finally free," her eyes stung with tears. But she smiled. "Free feels strange, but it feels good." They stood there in the dim light of the workshop, the sounds of the city faint in the distance. No cameras, no applause, no polished speeches, just two people, worlds apart yet bound by something deeper than status or wealth. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She didn't talk about fairy tales or destiny. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered: "Thank you for reminding me who I could be." He nodded, his eyes calm. "You reminded yourself. I just fixed a car." But deep down, they both knew it was more than that. Over the following weeks, her life changed. She still ran her company, but she no longer let it define her. She made time for people she had ignored before: her employees, her staff, even strangers. She found joy in small things: walking through the park, buying tea from a street vendor, laughing without worrying about her image. And every now and then, she returned to the garage. Sometimes she helped, sometimes she just watched, and sometimes they simply sat together in silence. The world still gossiped, still judged, but she no longer cared. Because the woman who had once mocked a man for his rough hands now understood that those same hands carried a strength no trophy could ever represent. The mechanic hadn't just fixed her car. Without even trying, he had helped fix her heart. And though the world might never understand their bond, she no longer needed it to. For the first time, she understood herself.